As we begin this chapter on social psychology, I'd like you to start by hitting the internet and taking a look at a few online dating profile pics. Online dating profiles or even social networking sites. You can use standard dating or career networking sites like Match, eHarmony, Monster.com, or even Indeed.com. You could also choose some alternative sites or photos that lend themselves to very specific stereotypes like business people, supermodels, athletes, or even teachers. If nothing else, Google online dating profile photos. That'll give you a place to start. Now, once you have a few pics to look at, consider your first impressions of these people. Whatever comes to mind. How well do you think the photos predict that person's personality or their behavior based on your first impression? How does this kind of photo influence other people? Are there any drawbacks to your first impressions? How do you think such photos might influence the hiring process or even a school application, both positively or negatively? Now, there are two important components of the self. We call that the self-concept, which are the beliefs we have about our own characteristics, and the self-esteem, or the evaluation of our own selves. Now, according to the theory of social comparison, people use other people as a basis of comparison for self-evaluation when no objective criteria exists. Social comparisons involve comparing oneself to groups of other people called reference groups. Temporal comparisons involve comparing one's own past state to a present state. As changes occur over the course of life, people change reference groups. People may find their self-evaluation to be poor in comparison to others in a new group and begin to experience what we call relative deprivation. What this means is that when we compare ourselves to others in a new group, we think of ourselves as deficient in some way. We think we're less than the other members of the new group. Now, in general, people do not compare themselves to others who are not in their immediate reference group. Chronic use of extreme reference groups can lead to depression and even anxiety. Terror management theory proposes that humans cope with anxiety, especially anxiety related to knowledge that death will eventually occur, by establishing and maintaining high self-esteem. Now, to test whether high self-esteem indeed buffers anxiety, researchers had 150 North American students participate in studies in which self-esteem was manipulated by having the participants take a test and providing either positive or neutral provoking situations that provided either positive or neutral feedback. Next, participants were placed in either an anxiety-provoking or a natural situation. Afterwards, anxiety was measured again. High self-esteem participants were less anxious in the anxiety-provoking situation than neutral self-esteem participants. Researchers concluded that the results supported terror management theory. Future research must examine other ways people manage anxiety, with particular emphases on other types of cultures. Now, many people form a social identity, which is also known as a group identity, which may create associations based on nationality, gender, or religion. However, social identities can also foster prejudice, discrimination, and intergroup conflicts based on the us versus them phenomenon. One's mental representation of the self, or the self-schema, can be unified or differentiated. People with a unified self-schema interpret failure as implying incompetence in all areas of their lives, whereas those with differentiated self-schemas limit feelings of failure to just the one failed life area. Self-schemas also contain future or possible selves. Discrepancies between the present and the desired future selves can contribute to feelings of depression. Now let's take a look at social perception. Social perception refers to the processes through which people interpret information about others, how they draw inferences about them, and how they develop mental representations of those same people. People often use schemas, or what we call mental representations, to perceive and interpret new information. Schemas influence our processing, retention, and judgment of new information. Now, schemas also facilitate the ability to develop first impressions, or the ability to quickly categorize a person that we've just met. We form first impressions quickly, and once they're formed, changing them is quite challenging. When forming impressions, most people give negative information more weight than positive information. In other words, we think poor information about others is more important or valid than positive information. First impressions are difficult to change because they shape how we understand new information. People tend to remember their initial general impressions much better than later corrections. Initial impressions can also create self-fulfilling prophecies, and what this suggests is that I will behave in ways that elicit behaviors consistent with my first impression of the other person. Now we make attributions about a person's behavior according to the internal characteristics of a person or to the external characteristics of that situation. How people go about making attributions will depend on consensus, consistency, and distinctiveness. An internal attribution is made if consensus is low, consistency is high, and distinctiveness is low. An external attribution is made if consistency and consensus are both either high or low, and distinctiveness is high. Now, what this means is that we will attribute bad things we think about someone else to some character or personal flaw. In other words, what that person over there is lazy because his clothes are dirty. The opposite is also true. When we consider difficulties with ourselves, it's because of some external force. In other words, I'm an awful person because my students yelled at me. Individuals from different cultures tend to make different kinds of attributions. Some give the same information. Individuals from one culture may take or make internal attributions, whereas individuals from another culture may make external attributions. When it comes to assessing others, no one is absent from bias. And what this means is that people tend to judge others based on the preconceived notions we've learned from other people. An example here is how my grandfather viewed people of color. My grandfather was a devout Baptist deacon, but he grew up in an era and in a place where those of color were not welcome, and they spoke of them using very derogatory names. Attributional biases are tendencies to systematically distort one's view of behavior. The fundamental attribution error is the tendency to attribute other people's behavior to an internal cause. The actor-observer bias is the tendency to attribute others' behaviors to internal causes and our own behaviors to external causes, especially when the behavior is inappropriate or involves failure. The self-serving bias is the tendency to take credit or to make an internal attribution for success and to blame external causes for failure. You'll find in the video description below a video about the fundamental attribution error. It's in the description below. Take a look if you have a chance. As in the self-serving bias, people are often motivated to think in ways that protect them from upsetting or threatening conclusions. Many people exhibit a pattern of unrealistic optimism, which means they believe that positive events are more likely than negative events, and negative events are then less likely to happen to them than to others. Unique invulnerability contributes to what we call that unrealistic optimism. Now let's take a look at attitudes. Our attitudes are the tendencies to think, feel, or act positively or negatively toward an object in our environment. Now, attitudes have three components. There's a cognitive or the belief, there's the affective or emotional component, and there's also the behavioral component, or how it is that we act. These three components are not always strongly aligned, and four factors will determine whether behavior will be consistent with other attitude components. First, agreement between the cognitive and the affective components. Second, attitude consistency with subjective norms, perceived control of the attitudinal behavior. And third, direct experience with the attitude objects. Another theory will also suggest that behavior will be affected by how easily interconnected evaluations and beliefs come to mind. Learning plays an important role in attitude formation. Social learning is especially important. Classical and operant conditioning can also produce positive or negative attitudes. The mere exposure effect will play a role in attitude formation. All else being equal, positive attitudes are positively correlated with exposure frequency. Now, it would be foolish of me to tell you that changing attitudes is easily accomplished. In general, persuasive communication can change attitudes depending on several factors. Attitudes change depending on three things: particular characteristics of the communicator, the content of the message, as well as the audience hearing that communication. Now, according to the Elaboration likelihood model of attitude change, messages can change attitudes with two routes. You can use the peripheral, or the generally ignores the content route, or the central route, which focuses on logic and content. The peripheral route is more likely when a person is busy thinking about something else. Cognitive dissonance theory holds that when our attitudes and behaviors are inconsistent or dissonant, people feel uneasy and are motivated to make them consistent. And one way to do this is to change the inconsistent attitude. Self-perception theory suggests that when situations occur in which people are unsure about their attitudes, they will observe their own behavior and infer what their attitudes must have been. Now, there are also a number of links between biology and social psychology. Social neuroscience is an emerging field that focuses on the influence of social processes on biological phenomenon, and vice versa. Research showing stress's health consequences points to the importance of this field. New research shows that the amygdala is more active when a European American prejudiced person looks at a picture of an African American than at a picture of a European American. Though still in its early infancy, social cognitive neuroscience shows promise for illuminating links between cognitive, social, and biological phenomenon. Now it's time to take a look at something that makes most of us at least somewhat uncomfortable, because none of us likes to think that we might be prejudiced or that we might look at others in some sort of stereotypical fashion. Stereotypes are general impressions or schemas of an entire group of people. They often lead to prejudice, a positive or a negative attitude toward that group. The behavior component of prejudice is often called discrimination. There are also various theories of prejudice and stereotyping. People with authoritarian personalities tend to accept traditional values and unquestioningly follow orders of authority figures. To protect themselves from threats, they strongly identify with their own ethnic, cultural, or social group, known as the in-group, and they develop negative stereotypes about people in their outgroups. From a cognitive perspective, given the complexity of the world, people tend to categorize others in groups. Grouping people into social categories can result in stereotypes and illusory correlations between behavior and an ethnicity. From a learning theory's perspective, as hard as it may be to hear, children almost always learn stereotypes from their caregivers, from their peers, and from others who are close to them. Now, given the reality of prejudice and stereotyping and their remaining at the forefront of Western cultures, I'm curious as to what you think about the ability to reduce it. Pardon me. Now, the contact hypothesis states that stereotypes and prejudices about a group should be reduced as friendly contact between members of equal standing in the two groups is increased. Research also suggests that intergroup contact has positive effects when members have equal social and economic status, or in the situation that demands interdependence and cooperation, when they have to interact on a one-on-one basis and are perceived as typical of that group. Now let's think critically for just a moment. Is ethnic prejudice too ingrained in this culture ever to be eliminated? It's an interesting question to ponder. People who deny having prejudices still have negative stereotypes about and show discrimination toward ethnic outgroups. These negative attitudes also run so deep in all of us that ethnic prejudice can never be eliminated. The theory of aversive racism suggests that although many European Americans find ethnic prejudice aversive, they will still display it, especially when they don't have to admit that they are prejudiced. Several studies show that people who consider themselves unprejudiced are inclined to discriminate. priming students shows that negative stereotypes can be activated even among those people who behave or believe that they are free of prejudice. Now, if people are unaware of their own prejudices, such views will be difficult to change, but unconscious stereotypes may not affect everyone in the same way. Responses of non-prejudiced people need to be compared in different experimental situations. One study found that when unconscious stereotypes are activated in non-prejudiced people, the effects are much more subtle. Prejudice may be subconscious in some people. We should carry on the fight against conscious stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination. Lastly, let's take a look at interpersonal attraction. There are a number of keys to personal attraction. To begin, there is the environment. Proximity is an important predictor of attraction. The more often people interact, the more they tend to like each other. The situation in which people meet also will influence attraction. If people meet others in positive circumstances, they are more likely to be attracted to each other. Similarity is a second key to personal attraction. People tend to like others who have attitudes similar to their own, especially attitudes about other people. Attitudes influence attraction, and attraction influences attitude. A third key to personal attraction is physical attractiveness. Sounds kind of reasonable. People tend to like people they consider to be attractive. But according to the matching hypothesis, people tend to form committed relationships with people who are similar in physical attractiveness. Now, when it comes to the notion of intimate relationships, interdependence and commitment to the relationship are the key components. Sternberg's triangular theory of love suggests that love functions in the form of intimacy, passion, and commitment. Romantic love is characterized by passion and intimacy. Compassionate love is marked by commitment and intimacy. The most complete and satisfying love is consummate love, which includes a high level of passion, intimacy, and commitment. When we're also considering the notion of marital relationships, there are what we call strong and weak marriages. People report high levels of marital satisfaction when the relationship is perceived as equitable. Marriages that will end in divorce do not involve more negative communications between partners than marriages that last longer periods, but they do involve significantly fewer positive communication. Social theory and social interaction and how it is we're attracted to one another is an exciting psychological topic. I'm one of the folks who happens to believe that many times people are far more attracted to other people than they're willing to let on. My curiosity for you is for you to ponder whether or not, to what degree, if any, prejudice and stereotypes can be eliminated in your world and how it is you think about others.